I caution immediately that my remarks will violate the first rule of a good lecture. I do not have a single clear argument to make. I have rather a series of reflections, ruminations, questions about questions that concern some of the central challenges the Western liberal tradition has had to face since it was founded, if you like, let's say the writings of John Locke in the 17th century. Questions about global power, internal security, and questions about population and identity. And these are issues about which I think the liberal tradition itself, this Western liberal tradition, has not had much to say from within, inside its own theoretical, conceptual, and analytical resources, and yet any realistic liberalism, and I speak as somebody who cherishes this tradition, I call myself a liberal, and I'm speaking of political liberalism. The word liberalism is often used in other ways, neoliberalism, economic liberalism. We could talk later, if you like, about the relationship of the one to the other, but I'm speaking about political liberalism. A tradition based, whose central conceptions are, as we all know, a good regime is a regime based on rule of law, on government by consent, on individual rights, and political representation. And these all require the existence of an active and open public sphere characterized by a range of cacophonous debates and multiple opinions. This tradition, so my starting point is simply the not very original statement that this tradition always faces challenges that about questions of population, global power, and internal security, because it lives in a real world, the tradition lives in a real world, that it does not make on its own, and with which it has to live and grapple. So the subject of this talk concerns these sets of challenges. Now first, I'd like to really do three things. First, say something about the liberal tradition itself. Second, something about these challenges. And third, about the ways in which responses to them have been or might be conceptualized. Some less desirable normatively and practically, and some more desirable normatively and practically. Now, we should remember that the Western liberal tradition was not born, I already mentioned the name John Locke, was not born as an act of abstract political theory or university reflection. What we've come to call Western liberalism, or liberalism, which is now not just Western, was fashioned and created as a response to profound, large-scale change in the way in which polities were organized and understood. In the medieval world, there was a world of politics in which sovereignty was widely dispersed, a world in which there were very few entities that resembled modern states. There, of course, was political power. Of course, there were kings who claimed sovereignty. But sovereignty was, in the language of Mary Anderson, was parcelized, was widely fragmented and distributed. And there was not much of a separation between property and sovereignty. So someone who was in charge, a lord, who was in charge of a rural fief, didn't only have economic property and capacity, that person possessed political sovereignty of a kind over his territory and those who worked and peopled that territory. Sovereignty in Europe reflected a checkerboard or a chessboard with not just the same number of squares you would have on a chessboard, but hundreds and hundreds of such squares that combined property, sovereignty, and often theology. The great revolution of the late medieval and early modern world was of a double kind. The concentration of sovereignty. It's as if sovereignty was extracted out of these hundreds of units and concentrated in new and capable sovereign states. And second, these sovereign states existed in a world of differentiated structures. They're developed side by side with these states, a zone that could be called the economy, a zone of property that was separate from the political in the first instance, and separately, also, as Habermas and others have written about, the creation of a zone of associational life in civil society that could not be reduced, at least for the bourgeoisie, to property or to the state. So you now have a world of states, economies, and property. States, economies, and civil society. Liberalism was born as a theory, as a set of conceptions, to ask how should the state be connected to these other new jumbo structures? What is desirable? What is normatively acceptable? So the idea of individual rights, which Locke, among others, wrote about, was the idea that the state cannot simply be predatory. It cannot do whatever it wishes. That individuals have certain assets, certain capacities, which cannot be taken away. They are, as it were, constitutionally existing as belonging to persons who are citizens. In turn, and you can read this in Locke's second treatise, he says, the central institution of any decent regime is the legislature. Why the legislature? Because the legislature is the place where citizens in civil society can have representatives who can make the state permeable to their interests and preferences. So the central idea of liberal politics, as early as 1689, 1690, 1693, was that the state may not do anything it wishes outside of the rule of law and rights, and that citizens with rights have the means through political action to affect what rulers do inside the state. This is revolutionary. This didn't exist before. It was outside of the imagination. The second key feature of the origins of liberalism concerned religious pluralism and bloodshed. Europe was soaked in blood. Locke's letter concerning toleration, again 1689, is about the question of what sociological solution is likely to reduce bloodshed. And his answer was a polity, as we all know, we all know the answer that he gave, which need not be the only answer, separate the church and state. Create yet another structural separation, not only between property and sovereignty, not only between civil society and the state, but also between theology and the state. Now, a given state could still be primarily Catholic or Protestant or others, but the rulers had no, on the one hand, had no capacity to deal with religious authorities who were orthodox unto themselves, that is his phrase, but in turn, religious authorities orthodox unto themselves had to live under the rule of secular law. They could not just do whatever they wished. Okay, I've now summarized something everyone in this room knows. This is the central structure or central set of conceptions of a polity that we call liberal. Further, normal liberal politics, not the kind of exceptional or emergency politics that I wish to talk about today, is always concerned with debate, because there's no single right answer, is always always concerned with debate about what the character of the transactions should be like that connect the state to civil society, the state to the economy, and the state to other states in a global system. If you have separate structures, and you have a politics governed by certain rules about how these structures should be tied to each other, and these are structures that must preserve rule of law, individual rights, government by consent, and so on. If you have such a situation, then normal politics, arguably peaceful normal politics, the politics of party competition, the politics of ideological debate, the politics of policy debate, is concerned with not ending the separations between these zones. The Bolsheviks sought to end the separation between property and sovereignty, but to manage a world in which these are separate zones. So economic debate always is debate about not whether to have markets and property, but how the state should regulate markets and property. And we have a wide, I'm sure in this room, remarkably varied opinions about the role of the state vis-a-vis the marketplace. There never is a market without state. The question is, how should it be organized? And there's always debate about the relation of state and civil society, about social questions, about how, if at all, citizens should be guaranteed different kinds of security. How should rights be made real? What does it mean in precise policy terms? And of course, there are always going to be debates about proper international relations, since a liberal state, like any state, exists in a world of states. That's normal liberal politics. What I want to speak about this evening is circumstances which are not simple. These are not simple normal politics, but when we move outside of the zone of normal liberal politics, it seems to me there are three sets of issues that always challenge the normal in the liberal political world. The first of these concerns population. We don't live in a world without boundaries. It therefore, from the beginning of at least the moment of John Locke to the present, is a persisting question. Who, precisely who, which people are eligible to be citizens of a liberal polity? How will the borders be policed? They can be external borders, as in issues of migration, immigration. They can be internal borders. Women, are they full liberal citizens? Well, until the 20th century, the answer was on the whole no. People without property, can they be full liberal citizens? Until much of the 19th century, the answer was no. Should black people be eligible to be liberal citizens? In the United States, until 1965, the Voting Rights Act, the majority of African Americans were excused from the franchise. Let's just put it in a delicate way. And indeed, the President of the United States, a Republican President, Taft, in 1909, delivered what probably was the most boring inaugural address by any president of the United States. You can read it, go online. It is, how much should the tariff on wool should be? Should it be $3 or $1.98? But in the middle of it, he says, I salute the American South for removing, and his phrase, ignorant people from the franchise. This was the end of the 20-year period which created rules that kept black people from voting. He said they have solved the riddle. They have learned how it's possible to meet the constitutional test of citizenship and an open franchise. And we have the 14th and 15th Amendments to the American Constitution preclude using race as a category of citizenship. This is after our Civil War, and guarantee the right to vote without reference to race. And yet he says the South has succeeded. Congratulations. So population, internal and external questions. Who gets to be a liberal citizen? There is only only one criterion within the liberal tradition that helps answer that question. And it's not always it has not always produced what we might call liberal answers. And the one criterion, which you also can read in the work of John Locke, is the capacity to be a rational actor in political life. A liberal citizen must be capable of deliberating, of participating as a deliberative citizen in political life. But who has such rationality? It was thought women did not have such rationality. Slaves and ex-slaves, black people in America, did not have such rationality. It was argued in my state of New York, when Irish came in the 1840s and 50s, they were not qualified as rational citizens. So the answers are always cultural. Sometimes people of a different religion are thought not to be capable of rationality in the full sense. The second big problem, which has always confronted the liberal tradition, is how to live in a world of power, global power. The world of global power is not an issue that plays by liberal rules. And the various Kantian prescriptions about power in the globe, which are very nice, but have not proved terribly realistic. And third, and not unrelated to questions of global power, are questions of internal security. And internal security concerns matters which take different forms. Sometimes internal security is thought to be threatened ideologically. This was true, for example, with respect to, in the 1940s and 50s, the way members of the Communist Party of the United States were considered as threats to the constitutional order. And in consequence of that categorization as a threat to internal security, our Congress debated and created the possibility of the executive to create what were called in the Congress concentration camps for communists should a war break out or an emergency situation with the Soviet Union. Now, the notion of concentration camps for citizens already had been practiced during the Second World War on Japanese Americans. 120,000 Japanese were interned in camps during the war. They had done nothing to show disloyalty, but the question of internal security arose. So internal security questions, in that case, the Japanese was not ideological. It was in terms of questions of physical security. Under conditions of war, would people who share not just national background, but even physiognomy with the other, would they be loyal to the United States? And third, issues of internal security sometimes take the form of just questions of not of ideology and not of physical security, but of identity. And we see this in the migration issues and crisis in Europe today, where the question is raised, if we, whoever the we is, as liberal citizens, permit the other who don't exactly worship like us, who don't speak like us, who have different personal experience, if we let them into our borders, what will happen to, quote, our identity? These are issues of national security, and of internal security, often connected to issues of global conflict and global security. So my remarks this evening are about the question of what resources we have and might be used within and about the liberal tradition to deal with the challenges of population, global power, and internal security, challenges that are unavoidable, that cannot be wished away as liberal regimes live in a world of power. Now, let me now say something historically and locate the moment we are in a larger historical context. If of John Locke was the first moment of the creation of something we, not he, call liberal. The word was never used by John Locke. Actually, that's not true. It appears once or twice in his second treatise, but he didn't mean exactly what we mean. The word liberal as a political word really dates from the 19th century. But there was a second moment of formation that I've actually written about with a colleague, Andreas Kalivas, in a book called Liberal Beginnings, which really concerns the late 18th and early 19th century. And it's at this moment, the moment of the American and French revolutions, that the liberal tradition, with these conceptions of rule of law and consent and individual rights and political representation and separation of church and state, they actually were made flesh in the American and French revolutions. It was no longer a question of what the ideal should be. The question arose in a very deeply practical way. The people who made these revolutions didn't call themselves or think of themselves as liberals. The word wasn't in use. In America, they thought of themselves as Republicans in the tradition of ancient Greece and Rome. But they collided with problems that the Republican tradition could not solve. Problems of scale. How do you create democracies, constitutional liberal orders that are as large as the United States and France? How do you deal with a modern commercial society, which the Athenians and Romans did not exactly have to deal with, though they had to deal with a global economy? How do you deal with religious pluralism? These are endless sets of questions that the Republican tradition had no answers for. And they invented solutions we call liberalism. And at that moment, liberalism was made flesh. We will also see in a moment how at that very moment, and we see this in the writings of the German jurist who then became a Nazi, Carl Schmitt, how he believed that the French Revolution gave birth to a set of ideas about sovereignty, about state authority, which posed alternatives to the liberal tradition, which challenged the liberal tradition, and which had the potential to undermine the liberal tradition. I'll come back to Schmitt in a few moments. But this second moment, the moment in which liberalism was made flesh, was represented in the 1830s and 1840s in the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville. Because Tocqueville's great works, his great two books, were about democracy in America and about the French Revolution in the context of the Ancien Regime. And in the shortest of shorthands, a key lesson Tocqueville took from liberalism made flesh was that as liberalism became not only real institutionally, but as it bonded with the great trend of the age, which he identified as the trend of democracy, a major set of choices opened in which democracy would either be liberal democracy or democracy would be illiberal, despotic democracy. This was a prophecy of great power, as it turned out. Because in this century, and I need not tell anyone who's lived in this region of the world, the 20th century dictatorships, whether fascist or Nazi or Bolshevik, all claimed to be democracies, people's democracies. And they claimed to be, proudly, if you like, illiberal democracies. Democracies that could represent the people, whether it be the German race, or whether it be the Italian nation or the working class, could represent the people more directly, more effectively than this messy liberalism stuff, which was full of cacophony and the absence of a clear public interest and of only provisional outcomes because it's the hallmark of liberal democratic politics that outcomes are always provisional. The policy your government adopts need not be the same policy my government adopts. You elect one set of rulers, as some of you did yesterday, and next time you elect a different set of rulers. Poland just had a major shift in who rules, who governs. The only thing required in liberal democracies is that the rulers, and whether it proves true, say in Poland, remains to be seen, remain true to the essential liberal values. So to have a liberal democracy means there's a lot of variation, oscillation, provisionality, but always within the framework of rule of law, of government by consent, of individual rights, and so on. But there are illiberal democracies. Prime Minister Orban in Hungary proudly declared last July that Hungary was not a liberal democracy. It was, in his language, an illiberal democracy. So Tocqueville understood this. And the question I want to raise is not for us this debate or dispute between illiberal democracies and liberal democracies, which is an important subject, or between totalitarianism and democracy, or authoritarianism and democracy, or Putinism, or Peronism and democracy. Rather, I want us to think in the time remaining to me about how liberal democracies like the United States, which has had a consistent constitutional order for more than 2 centuries, how they deal with, how we deal with these questions of population, national security, internal security, where liberalism necessarily bumps up against illiberalism, non-liberalism. That's the question I want us to deal with. Now, in the 20th century, a century more than half of I have experienced in life, right? Unlike some young people in the room, who 20th century seems like the 18th century. But there was a moment before my birth, the moment that begins with the First War and culminates with the Second, in which liberal democracy after liberal democracy after liberal democracy after liberal democracy failed, collapsed. By the start of the Second World War, in Europe and in North America, there were a handful of such liberal democracies left. And these democracies, first under great pressure, as in Weimar, and then the survivors, Britain, some Scandinavian countries, the United States, for a while France, but then France was captured, had to think hard about how to deal with emergency, how to deal with global challenges, how to deal with internal security. And this, of course, is the moment when some of the most powerful political theory about emergency situations was created. I mentioned already Carl Schmitt. But in addition to Schmitt, I wanted to put on the table in a moment, if you'd be patient with me, an alternative model that was generous and has much been forgotten, even in its country of origin, the United States. An alternative way of thinking about how to deal with emergencies and liberal exceptions. A group of thinkers who knew about Schmitt and refused his solutions and sought more liberal solutions. I'll come back to that. But I want to, if you allow me, to say a few things about the American New Deal, which, as I believe in listening to the Bulgarian you mentioned, is a subject I've had some concern for. So, the United States was not exempt from the problems of emergency. First of all, it was a global economic emergency, the collapse of capitalism. But there also was, by the time Franklin Roosevelt was in power, Hitler, who was inaugurated as chancellor at the end of January of 1933, and President Roosevelt only takes the oath of office in the end, late March of 1933. So the issue of how to deal with emergency, which occurred mostly in this framework of how to deal with economic emergency, but with challengers who were illiberal democracies, the Bolshevik, the fascist, the Nazi, was on everybody's mind as Roosevelt became president of the United States. The most important columnist in the United States in this period, a journalist, was Walter Lippmann. Many of you will know the name. He wrote the following in January and February 1933, just after Hitler rose to power. The present legislative machine in Washington is incapable of governing during an emergency. The danger we have to fear is not that Congress will give Franklin Roosevelt too much power, but that it will deny him the power he needs. And he recommended a decision, and I quote, and the word decision is a very Schmittian word, recommended a decision, and I quote, to suspend temporarily the rule of Congress, to limit drastically the right of amendment and debate, to put the majority in both houses, that is the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, under the decisions of a party caucus. Well, this is a party governance model, in which the decisions would be taken not by the legislature, but by the party. And give the president, for a period, say, of a year, the widest and fullest powers under the most liberal interpretation of the Constitution. He went to visit Franklin Roosevelt. He offered this advice, and President Roosevelt, in his famous inaugural address, in which he told us we should not fear itself, a very famous statement, said the following: in the event that Congress shall fail to take one of the two courses that I've just said, I shall not evade the duty that will then confront me. And the word duty was also a very powerful word. Not exactly a democratic word, actually, for the ruler to say, I have a duty. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power, to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if in fact we were invaded by a foreign foe. And this is a decade and a half after the end of the First World War, where every Western democracy gave their executives emergency powers. So he, in peacetime, was saying he would ask for exception, emergency power. The greatest thing about the American New Deal is this never happened. We never suspended Congress. We never eliminated legislative power. We never even suspended elections during the Second World War, the way the British did. American liberal democracy continued, but we did pass enabling acts, as these acts were known of legislatures to give legislative power to the executive. Mussolini, by the way, the first thing he did after the March on Rome in 1922 was to have the Italian Parliament pass an enabling act that transferred all legislative powers to Mussolini and his cabinet. In 1933, in March 1933, just as Roosevelt was being inaugurated, Hitler had the Reichstag pass an enabling act that transferred all legislative power to the executive. So the idea of transferring power to the executive, when Roosevelt spoke about executive power, was not an abstraction. And as I said, it never happened. However, quickly read enabling acts that did happen. In 1939, the President of the United States declared what he called a limited state of emergency. We were not at war. It's a kind of state of siege, in which he declared the right, without legislation and without any constitutional warrant or reason, declared a limited state of emergency that gave him the power to move population around, to seize capital, to do all kinds of things. In 1940 and 41, the legislature passed the first time ever, this is by legislative act, peacetime conscription, in which citizens could be made to serve in the army. 1941, President Roosevelt declared a full state of emergency. And if you read it, you would find the powers he gave himself were as great as that of any dictator in the 20th century. He then created an Office of Censorship. Congress then passed the Congressional War Powers Act, which legitimated all the powers he had seized for himself. The president made a speech in 1942 and said, Congress has passed a Price Control Act. If they don't revise it, I will revise it without legislative approval. And then he interned Japanese citizens by executive order. Congress passed no law saying that Japanese have to go to concentration camps. The president decided this. And I say concentration camps in a not quite the sense that it was being used, but that concentrated them in camps. And then after the war, against their will, Congress passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 that declared all uses of atomic energy, peaceful as well as military, belong exclusively to the President of the United States. So if he chooses to drop another atomic bomb, he doesn't have to ask us. He just can do it. He asks nobody. President Truman in 1947 declared there would be loyalty investigations of anyone who worked for the federal government. What happened to individual rights? Investigations about their ideological belief, whether or not they had ever done anything that challenged the Constitution of the United States. And finally, in 1949, the Congress passed amendments to the National Security Act of 1947, and these amendments exempted such institutions as the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, from budgetary oversight by Congress. Once they got their money, they didn't have to tell normal democratic politics what they did with their money. Okay. Now, this is the moment, this long moment, and may I take 10 more minutes, Mr. Chairman? With permission.
It's an emergency case.
It's an emergency. I'm violating the rules of 40 minutes. I will speak for 50. It's exactly in this period that we get theorization, if you like, of what to do. What are liberal regimes meant to do faced with emergency? Geopolitical emergency, ideological, totalitarian competition emergency, war, economic emergency, all these emergencies. Schmidt, I neither have time nor would I have the capacity to give a very detailed account of Carl Schmitt's writings, which to this day I find hard to read, even though they're very brilliant. Schmitt basically said, again, it's a simple but I think accurate statement, that liberalism was not capable of solving these dilemmas. That the only capability to solve these dilemmas could be found in what he called a sovereign dictator. And a sovereign dictator is a dictator outside the law and capable of making law, creating a whole new situation. You can later understand this fascination with the Third Reich. This is okay, outside the law. And what's the legitimacy of such a sovereign dictator? It is the abstract idea of a unified people. So there is sovereignty ultimately resides with the population, but it's an abstract category. It's not instantiated or placed inside competitive institutions. There is a direct line between the sovereignty of the people and the sovereignty of the dictator, who governs for the people, who protects the people, who is the people, without the messiness of liberal institutions of law and legislation and rights. But there was in this period an alternative theoretical model which has been forgotten and that I wish, if you allow me, to resurrect. Names you may not know. If anybody knows any of these names, raise your hand. The third one I think some will know. Frederick Watkins. 0. Lindsay Rogers. 0. Clinton Rossiter. Anyone? 0. Perfect. If I said Carl Schmitt, how many know Carl Schmitt? Exactly all. Point made. I should stop now. But what these people were, they were all, they were actually trained, most of them, by German immigrants. Carl Friedrich is a name you might know, who's a professor of political science at Harvard. He taught Frederick Watkins. Watkins taught Clinton Rossiter, and so on. These were people who thought very much in the tradition of Hans Kelsen, who debated much with Schmitt in Germany. But they sought to create an American tradition of emergency, of liberal emergency. And what they insisted on was that emergency must be made consistent with the lawful constitutional traditions of liberalism. And they argued, how could that be? And the core analytical or theoretical argument was that sovereignty is a matter of legal competence and jurisdiction. It's not something that exists outside the rule of law. And therefore, anyone who has temporary powers, like the Roman dictators did, there were 95 or 96 dictators in the history of Rome. These were people who governed for a maximum of 6 months, and they were brought to power by legislative action. It requires working through the normal institutions, and moreover, there had to be limits on what could be done under emergency conditions if those actions violated the constitutional arrangements of a liberal democracy. This mode of crisis government had to have limited temporality, and had to be judged, had to be created by delegation by the legislature, delegation that could be removed, not like the enabling acts of Hitler or Mussolini, but they could come back. Now, you could argue whether this was realistic or not realistic and so on, and I don't have time to go in any great detail into their texts. But I want to truly end with the following thought. The situation, and I'll speak now from a U.S. perspective, and how germane it is for other places, I look forward to learning, but in the United States, the idea that the rule of exception, the rule of emergency, the rule of special situations within the framework of law could be temporary, no longer can be said to be the case. Because once the United States created a new kind of national security state in the late 1940s, a state in possession of atomic weapons, a state where the key agencies are exempted permanently from making reports to democratically elected politicians, etc., etc., then we're on a different world. We're in a world not of procedural democracy, a democracy thick with procedures. And the United States is thicker with procedures than almost any democracy you can name. To pass a law, a normal political law about state and economy or state and civil society in the United States, very hard to do. In Britain, the Prime Minister announced, the Queen announces, Her Majesty's government will do the following, and Her Majesty's government does do the following through law. In the United States, President Obama can say, please, kindly, pass a new law about immigration, and good luck to you, right? But the other side of the state, which I like to call a crusading state, a state with strong sense of democratic public interest. It is against dictatorship. It is against terror. It is against illiberalism. It is for liberalism. It is for democracy. It has no procedural constraints. If the President of the United States decides, as President Obama did, to assassinate an American citizen in Yemen because he has broadcast on the internet incitement against the United States, he's not brought to trial. He's not innocent before proven guilty. He simply, by decision of the executive sovereign, is killed. I'm not now arguing whether this is a good decision or a bad decision, but it's not a normal liberal democratic decision. So what we have now is a permanent circumstance, not the kind of temporary circumstance that was imagined by Mr. Watkins, Mr. Rossiter, and others, Mr. Rogers, in the 1930s and 1940s, early 1940s, but a permanent state of exception. Well, then what do we do about that? What do we do with this permanent emergency? And I should say, this permanent emergency was accelerated and exacerbated during the administration of George Bush, George Bush II, if you like. We still may get Bush III, but this is Bush II. I read now, I'm ending with the work of lawyer Samuel Zakharov, who's at NYU Law School, who writes about fragile democracies. He has a new book called Fragile Democracies. He writes, in each of these earlier circumstances, Franklin Roosevelt he includes, Abraham Lincoln he includes in the Civil War, in each of these circumstances, an effort was made to enlist Congress as an ally in the policy decision, even if this effort was made after the decision had been initiated. By contrast, during the Iraq War, through decisions over detentions and torture, the persistent Bush executive claim was of exclusive and unaccountable powers flowing from the president's role as executive and commander-in-chief. That is a Schmittian sovereign dictator, not a liberal, if you like, emergency circumstance. So I end by asking, in my last 2 minutes, but really by way of raising the question, I was about to say, but I shouldn't say what is to be done. That's not a good way to ask it in this environment. But what is to be done? It's not a bad question. It seems to me, there are questions, fundamental questions about democratic accountability. And I'm going to really close by something I was just telling Yvonne about before I started. In the last months, there was discovered in the National Archive of the United States a document written in the midst of the American Civil War by a political scientist who had come from Germany named Francis Lieber. He was also the chairman of the political science department at my university, Columbia University, when a department was first created after the Civil War. During the war, he was asked by President Lincoln to write a memorandum about emergency powers. How do you deal with the emergency in a liberal democracy? And Lieber announced two fundamental principles. The first was a principle that is very reminiscent of the political theory, more than a century later, of John Rawls, the great liberal thinker, who told us that we should imagine the rules for a good, just liberalism by imagining what reasonable people would think behind what he called a veil of ignorance. We just know we're human beings. We get into a room together, we reason, we argue, and then we create something just. Lieber said, Mr. President, your emergency powers and the use of those powers, we know are outside the zone of normal politics. First, they must be temporary, but more important, they must meet the test of what he called a reasonable person test. That is, if you really could gather a reasonable, deliberative group of citizens, they would think with you that under these conditions, what you're doing, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, for example, or freeing the slaves in areas occupied that are in the South under the control of the Confederacy. Not, by the way, under the control of the U.S. government. It was a war act. That, you must meet that test. And second, really, I said second, I mean, there are three things. Second, it must, whatever you do, must be open to retrospective judicial review. Not to punish you if you violated the constitutional limits unjustly or excessively, but retrospective judgment that would teach the next round of emergency what the limits ought to be of the use of exceptional power. And finally, not just a reasonable person test and judicial review afterwards, but the extraordinary powers you utilize must be utilized in as temporary a basis as possible. So even if it's true that we have atomic weapons, even if it's true that we have situations that inevitably call for decisions quickly outside the zone of normal politics, you must work to limit those as much as possible. You must work to least disturb traditional civil liberties, rights, and normal politics. And you must be willing not just to seize power, but to relinquish it when the situation of emergency passes. So if we needed in the United States something we called a Patriot Act immediately after 9/11, that does not necessarily mean that permanently we should have a security apparatus that can listen to every telephone call ever made by an American citizen. You should have to, now Mr. Lieber did not know about the telephone, but if you move his principles, they're principles of self-limitation, under the reasonable person test and under retrospective judicial review. I'm not sure those are precisely the right answers, but I do think that unless we develop instruments and tools of that character, even our strongest liberal democracies will become too often illiberal.